And here we are for session 6. Revelation is a revolution. Today, I think we've got some pretty interesting subjects here. I hope what I'm going to present is pretty new to you. We're going to start out with topic of the mark of the beast and go through the last little part of Revelation chapter 13, and then we'll go on to something else. And I think that that's going to be the main part for tonight, plus kind of a sidebar. So what did you do during the war, Daddy? I don't know if you men have ever been asked that question by a daughter or a son, but a lot of people today could say, well, we didn't have any war when I was that age, but I guess I better not tell you what I did during the war, but we're going to look at some people to see what they did during the Jewish war. And I think that would include even Paul, Josephus, a couple more that you've heard of right here. But let's start with the mark of the beast, or better, the stamp of the beast. Let me share my screen and just show you the text. And yes, if you want to know something and I can give you an answer, please just break in here. Otherwise, I won't even know it probably that you're there. I guess you can see the application now. Start here at lesson 6. Father, please give us enlightenment tonight. Help us to get things right. Help us to understand how your history has a lot to do with how we interpret the mystery of the scripture. Amen. 13:16. And it makes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, the free and the slave, so it might give them a stamp on the hand of them, the right one, that is, hina dosin atwa karigma epi tes keros aton tes desius. There we go. That's pretty good. A stamp. Or on the forehead. He epi to metapon aton. And I looked up this word that's always in the scripture translated as the mark, charagma. It almost sounds like an English word, like charisma or something like that. And I wanted to see what was the best one-word translation for that, because often, especially in the scripture, when they use those traditional translations that are often so off today, they will put in what has become a second or third or even a fourth translation instead of using the number one translation, the best. So I've checked with katabiblon.com. I use it once in a while to find out what the best translation is for some of these words. And here it says the best translation for charagma is stamp. Mark was in there too, but it was way back a little bit. And that would indicate that Mark was not, but kind of an inferior definition. But if we look at something given that brings this kind of result, we want to know what that is. And if we continue to look for the mark of the beast, we're going to continue to look for something that it may not be. So then in 17, and so nobody should be able to buy or sell if that one doesn't have the stamp, same word, with the beast's name or its name's number. That gives us a set of clues. It's a stamp. They couldn't buy or sell. We got a history book. And it begins to strike me right away that this has got to have something to do with finances, maybe taxes. We used to have something when I was in the elementary school called a tax stamp in Ohio, where whenever you'd buy something, the store would staple a set of little green or purple stamps onto your sack when you left. I don't know what they were for. They were called tax stamps, but I think what they did in schools is they collected these. And then the school could turn them in for a little bit of money for the government and to help them to get stuff for the teachers to do their lessons, supplies. So when I first read this stamp, I thought tax stamp. And if you go back as far as 15 or 20 years and look at my notes, it was the same thing then. I actually brought into the lesson a picture of a green tax stamp. Aha, I haven't seen one for a long, long time. So we've got the issue of the inability to buy or sell. And you can understand why there have been such reachings for what that might be in our particular time. And we get everything from RFID chips to who knows what. But I became acquainted about 10 years with a fellow named Steve Westcott. He has a theory on the mark that's got to be correct. And some of that, I have his actual words online here someplace. The mark or the stamp of the beast is obviously a tax stamp. And here's the story behind that. And here's Stephen Westcott from Bristol, England. I saw this in a book and I called him up in England. I hope I didn't wake him up. The empire hired thousands of tax farmers. The word is telones, through the empire. They are called farmers because they were to maximize their crops, which were taxes, by any means they could, coercion and torture included. They had a full line of tools to get all the taxes they could. Their pay came out of what they were able to collect. Think about Zacchaeus, that is Zacchaeus in the gospel. We don't know if he was a tax collector for the Jews or a tax collector for the Romans. I'm thinking probably the Jews because he was pretty devout. But Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. And he was, by his own admission, a tax farmer that had to climb up a sycamore tree. And Matthew, the disciple, was also some kind of tax farmer. Matthew was pretty rich as well and educated, either for Rome or for the temple. Obviously, especially if these were Roman tax collectors, they didn't have many friends except other tax collectors and other robbers. Both types of agents could go to extreme measures to get what they needed or what they wanted, even to the point of taking someone's property away. They were the most hated of all people in the Roman world, just like the IRS is today, with its, how many? 80,000 new telones. Sounds like a Mexican dish that you could get at a Mexican restaurant. Here we have a nice little story in Matthew 9:10. When the Pharisees saw that, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Interesting story, but you remember what Yahshua said, and in this case, I probably don't. But in the case of Rome, they could take 50% or more of the gross earnings of the teacher or farmer or trash collector or widow or orphan, plus whatever the tax farmer extorted from them. The rich, then as today, had their loopholes. Here's a story from Matthew 17. When they came into Capharnaum, those who received the tax came to Kepha, that's Peter, and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" He said, "Yea." And when he came into the house, Yeshua spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Shimon? From whom the sovereigns of the land take toll or tax? From their own sons or from the strangers?" Cephas then said to him, "From the strangers, of course." Yeshua retorted, "Then the sons are exempt from taxes." Of course, the tax collector's sons never had to pay any taxes. Still the same way today. Look at Hunter Biden. He gets away with murder, as do some other people do, because they've got relatives in high places. I think that's called simony. Millions of dollars from China, from Russia, from the Ukraine, and here the guy's scot-free. Unbelievable. But Kepha then said to Yeshua, "Course from strangers." Yeshua said to him, "Then the sons are exempt, but lest we cause them to stumble, go to the sea, cast in a hook, and take the fish that comes up first. And when you've opened its mouth, you'll find a piece of money. Take that and give it to them for me and you." You believe that story? Come on, do you believe it? Like a silver coin out of the mouth of that fish. Yeah, I believe it. That's not too far-fetched. So the tax Yeshua and Kepha paid appears to me to be the temple tax. So who's asking here? Pharisee? Did you pay your taxes? Oh, if you didn't, we're going to turn you in, which was a set amount. And as I keep saying, the assembly, the church, the synagogue is not to be financed by tithes, but by dues, which the Old Testament, the Torah calls taxes in English. And that was the 1/2 shekel of silver. I'm trying to think of whether that was yearly or quarterly. I know for some people that was a big amount, but it was the same for everybody. Everybody that was living in Israel, Arab, Heretz Israel, or in Asian Israel. I mean, the greater Israel outside of the boundaries of Israel. And Marcia's got some of these shekels. I think the last time we did something like this, she got them out. This is pictures of the Reuven Prager half-shekel coin. I looked into this again. This is instituted for the third temple in Jerusalem, if they ever have one, and I'm hoping they didn't. But this is the half-shekel silver coin that they have already ordained to be used when the temple is here again, and people are collecting these. And one article about these, as I mentioned, I look at today, they're worth 70 million right now. There's 70 million of them out there. And just think, Marcel, if you still got those, if you haven't got so broke that you had to sell them, you can get into the new temple and watch the sacrifices. I also found something else about Reuven Prager. He's our friend of blessed memory. He passed away 2023, just last year. I haven't had time yet to find out why or how, because he wasn't an old man. He's the one that designed and manufactured the new temple tax, half-shekel coin. within the last decade or so for the Third Temple. Now, Prager was, I hate to say was, but he was a tailor in Jerusalem. He tailored outfits for the new Sanhedrin and whatever else was coming through the Temple Faithful organization there for the new temple. And he made his money tailoring, but also he would come to the United States during the off season there, and he would give lectures about this stuff and everything Jewish. He came to our group a couple of times and very, very interesting. I bought an outfit from him, $700 for that outfit. Wow, I must have been mesmerized. But we got to meet him and know him for a little bit, and I was just shocked to hear that he's gone. So, oh, here's one coming up here. Okay. Oh, well, yeah, okay, book tomorrow. You got a prayer shawl. I don't know why or how he died, but on Facebook, if you look him up, his son put up a group for him, and that son supposedly has pictures of him on there and all the information, but there are a lot of posts on there. So I just didn't have time to get down more than the last couple of years, and I didn't see anything concerning his death, and it might not even be on there. So once a taxpayer had been fleeced, they received a stamp. I guess I can get off of here now for a minute. On their goods, on themselves, to show other collectors that they had paid for particular years. They had to have that available wherever they went, because they were bound anytime to be asked, let's see your tax stamp. So the income tax stamp generally had an image of the emperor, who was a god, the emperor god, an abbreviation of his name, and the Roman year it was for. If they had a tax stamp with those three requirements on it, then we've got another clue here as to what this is. So again, did I mention Stephen Westcott? Yeah. He wrote an article for the book Back to the Future. The book is by Ralph Bass. If you are interested in this stuff, you'll probably want to get Ralph Bass's book. It's great, and I'll help you to correct some of the errors Ralph has. It's an expensive book too, so maybe you can find a sale if you ever want it. Back to the Future. He writes on the same subject I'm talking about. He theorized, Westcott that is, that the tax stamp was the actual mark or stamp of the beast, because it fulfills all the requirements, including that no one could buy or sell without the stamp. You couldn't make any money without it. It's kind of like the Social Security number today. You can't really work unless you're working illegally without that. In fact, a stampless taxpayer could do no type of legal business at all. Why there were so many bandits in the land. Everywhere you looked, every road between towns were very violent, hostile bandits living in the caves. Without the stamp, the talones could hunt you down and fleece you for everything you had, and they did. Millions upon millions collected went into the emperor's coffers, not into the coffers of the Roman Empire, but into the pockets of the emperor. And you can think that's probably the largest empire that there's ever been up until recent times. The empire itself was, well, 12 different provinces all over the place. It was more money than any one person could ever spend, except Nero. Toward the end of his term, he was having the rich executed. for nothing, except that he wanted to seize their properties in order to enrich himself all the more. He took all that money from the taxes for himself, till by the end of his time, the entire Roman Empire, certainly the legislation of the empire, was done. No money left. So let's get rich people, let's get senators, let's take away what they have, and we'll get to do more traveling, we'll get to buy more statues, and we won't have to worry about them because they'll be dead. We'll kill them. It's like Baby Doc's wife, Michelle. Maybe you don't know about that, but there was an interview with the president of Haiti's wife sometime back, probably in the 80s, that I remember, with Baba Wawa on TV, Michelle Duvalier. And Michelle was asked by Baba Wawa, why did you take all the money out of the Haiti treasure instead of having it to improve your land or anything, and take that for yourself and buy it for yourself? And she said, well, it was my money. It was my money. And that was a shocker to everybody that watched that. Of course, they had to go into exile, and nobody even knows where they are now. Nero considered all funds belonging to the empire, that they really belonged to him. And no one dared to contradict. Nero spent huge amounts of money, mostly on whatever he wanted. After all, he was the deified Nero, a god worshipped by everyone in the empire, but those who stubbornly refused, and they were found out too, and they gave their lives unless they started to worship him. I want to show you something here. Here's one tax stamp that survived. You can see that's a picture of Helios on there, the sun god. And that's on eBay. I think it's $75, so it might be a fake. But it makes no difference because that's what it looked like. With it had the emperor's number or name. It had the date on it. Here's how it looks from another angle of it. That thing would be inked, stamped on goods. Westcott couldn't tell me whether it was stamped on people or not, but Scripture says that if this is it, it was. And Westcott actually drew a picture of what it looked like based on one that they had from the Emperor Augustus. These things are not, they're not too common. They're hard to find, but you can see some. And on here, Augustus, we have his number and his name. And in other ones that I looked at on eBay, they had the picture of the emperor on it, that they just take and stamp the people or stamp their goods, probably both. Mystery solved. Mystery solved. The Roman tax and its collectors were the primary secular reason that the Jewish war even started, along with the brutal treatment of the Jews by Romans and Greeks, or Hellenist Jews, and the ineffective and anti-nationalistic attitudes of the priesthood. Another reason mentioned by Origen, that's O-R-I-G-E-N. Some people pronounce that wrong as Origen, but it's Origen, just like he was an Irishman. Origen, quoting Josephus, that the execution of James the Just, Yeshua's brother, by that priesthood, we are told, was the splinter that broke the camel's back, or whatever that epithet is. The splinter that broke the camel's back. Now, Origen lived in about 185 AD, died in 254, right after the capture by Rome of the so-called Christian faith. And he died in Phoenicia, which is down there north of Israel. He was the most important theologian and biblical scholar in the early Greek church. But he lived in Israel. He was in the Greek church. So Origen, you can read his stuff if you want to. I don't read it, or any of the other Gentile stuff from that time. The number of the beast is next. Let's take a look at that. I took a nap. I just woke up a half hour ago. I had such a wonderful dream. I'm still kind of in that dream. I'm in there right now. So I'm doing this, and some of that's coming back to me while I'm doing it. No, I'm not going to tell you what it's about. The number of the beast in 1318 says, here is Chokmah, here is wisdom for the one having a mind to calculate the beast's number, for it's a man's. And its number is hexakoisoi, hexakonta, hex. Here it is in Greek letters. 666. That is, these are the letters in English transliterated. The first one is a key, CH. Second one is an X or a Z. The third one is a stigma, not sigma, stigma. And that's an S. Key, Z, stigma, 666. And here we have the actual mark of the beast. It's in the manuscripts of Revelation. That little figure right there. I'm sure you've seen it before. 666. Now, the mark of Messiah in the earliest Bibles is key stigma. Key looks like an X, it's K. And the stigma, of course, is a S sound at the end of a word. And it's the first letter and last letter of the word Christos. And evidently some who were scribes back in the earliest days, 2nd, 3rd century, I suppose, they considered Yeshua's name to be Christos. So they considered a sacred name. So they didn't write it in their early Bibles, but rather they wrote key stigma with a line over the top as a sacred name. They didn't want to let the name out, just like in the Old Testament, Pharisees and rabbinicals, you're not allowed to say that name. You're not even allowed to look at it. Sacred names in the New Testament. In pictography, you can almost see this is something happening here. Is the serpent standing between a broken Christ? The serpent is as a conqueror. So what more evidence do we need that 666 isn't Ronald Reagan or Bonnie Prince Charlie? I mean, this is two things that are very, very proving to me. And I can't see why some people are so stubborn they won't even look at this. I don't know. They'd rather keep the idea of a chip they're going to put in you or some other thing. I'm going to go over to a Roman historian here, and that is Tacitus, or I pronounce it Tacitus, the way they would pronounce it in the empire in those days, regarding the 64 AD fire of Rome. just going to talk a little more about this beast. Tacitus, he has a set of books out. You can still get them. And they are chronicles of the Roman Empire in the time span that we're looking at here, from about 55 AD to about 120 AD. That was about Tacitus' lifespan. So he's a contemporary of the beast. I love his books. They're very readable today, and I've got several of the volumes of this in very small books. I read them a lot. Whenever you need something to read, you pick up that. You think you wouldn't want to read that history because it's so old and ancient and out of date, but it's interesting, and it's also quite entertaining. Well, he was the great Roman historian, Tacitus. A civil servant, he was a pagan. He'll tell us in a minute what he thought about the Christians. He left us a first-hand account of the aftermath of Nero's fire that destroyed Rome in his journal, Annals. Tacitus was there, and he writes these words: to put an end to the rumor that he had started the fire, Nero created a diversion and subjected to the most extraordinary tortures those hated for their abominations by the common people, those called Christians. Though they didn't call themselves that, of course, for to be called that was an insult. In their language, the word really means smears. And you can imagine what they were called smears of. It wasn't a very clean thing. Tacitus continues, the originator of this name, Christus, had been executed by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Repressed for the time being, the deadly superstition broke out again, not only in Judea, the original source of the evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and become popular. So an arrest was made of all who confessed. Then, on the basis of their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of arson, but for hatred of the human race, misogyny. Did you notice how Tacitus speaks of Christians? Of course he did. As despised for their deadly superstition, that so many were arrested, so many were tortured and put to death at that time, since Nero was so serious about blaming them for the burning of Rome. And what were they arrested for? Primarily, he says, hatred of the human race. Tacitus goes on to describe the punishment of the Christians. He continues with these words: mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames. These served to illuminate the night when the daylight failed. Nero had thrown open the gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or drove about in a chariot. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being punished. Such horrors might not have happened to the Christians had they worshipped the beast's heads, but they wouldn't bow down. And there we have actually the historian talking about the beast's heads. Did he get that from the Revelation, or did the Revelation get that from him? The beast and his heads, Nero being the sixth head. Lots of clues here. The mortal wound is next. And I've talked about this a little bit already. I don't know if it was last week or the week before. After the destruction of Christians, according to the Greeks, Nero went off to Greece with the last of the Roman money to perform in acting contests while his whole emperor was going down the drain. He was very popular in Greece. He was a celebrity. All the competitions that he entered, he won them all. When he returned, the capital was found to be in revolt. A full-fledged military coup was underway. With the help of the hapless Epaphrodites of Bible fame, Philippians 4 and 2, Nero escaped the palace, was cornered, then fatally stabbed himself in the head, putting an end to a family dynasty in 68 AD that traced clear back to Julius Caesar, 100 years. The Revelator speaks of Nero's death, or at least the wounding of his head in 13:3. One of the heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth followed the beast with wonder. So he had a head wound, but the wound was healed. I've already gone into that story a little bit, but I'm going to at least mention again here, because I know some of you weren't here that time. Of course, as I mentioned, we're talking about the sixth head, Domitian Nero Ahenobarbus, the Redbeard Ahenobarbus, and he did die, as I explained earlier, but not before he'd spent years martyring Christians all over the world. You can throw Jews in there too. They called them all that. Setting a policy of persecution for several emperors to come, including Domitian 30 years later, who was known as the second Nero. But he didn't die because he'd seen the deaths of Peter, Andrew, and Paul, and the exile of John to the copper mines of Patmos, where he penciled the book we now study. And Nero didn't die before he sent Roman armies to Israel to destroy her and flatten and burn Jerusalem in the wake of an uprising there, caused in part by the taxes. The magnificent temple, as you know, was entirely destroyed, with its holy of holies stacked to the ceiling with corpses. Yahshua was there with his army, not of angels, but his army of 144,000 spoken of in chapter 7, bodily spirits. You know, you're in the spirit. You might not be in the flesh body, but you have a spirit body, and it has weight, and it has, well, it's a real body. I don't know what else we can call it because I just don't know. So those spirits on the top of Mount Zion, those that the Bible calls saints, Yahshua had returned to oversee the fulfillment of the prophesied day of Yahweh, fulfilling the prophets Hosea, Joel, and several others, just as Yahweh of the sky rained down the destruction of Sodom through Yahweh of earth. Several places in the Old Testament, both in the Torah and later on, it talks about Yahweh decreeing something or doing something wherever Yahweh is. which I guess is everywhere. They call that the Yahweh of the sky. And on the earth, another Yahweh fulfilling the will of the Father, that is to say, as Joshua said, my Father is working and so am I. So two Yahwehs, I got teachings on that out on YouTube, and they're good. What Yahweh was doing in the skies, Yahshua was doing on the earth, time after time. He even admits to it. And there is some outside testimony as well, with a witness that comes forth that can tell you that this is something that was happening. So I'm going to leave till next week. So there's Yahweh of the sky, Yahweh of the earth, and in the case of Sodom, Yahweh of the sky rained down the destruction of Sodom through Yahweh of the earth. You ought to go look at that passage, Genesis 19:24. Earlier on, Yahweh of the earth was eating lunch with Moses and some other people. In Genesis 16, Yahweh of the earth was walking with two other fellows to Abraham's camp. Remember that part? Sarah laughed. Right? That is Genesis 16. So that's a little bit about the mortal wound. But
Brother
remember,
Jackson, can I ask a question?
yeah,
I'm confused. You're talking about two different Yahwehs.
yeah,
Wouldn't one be Yahweh and the other one Yahushua?
yeah.
Uh,
I'm just saying that the prophecies and the Old Testament doesn't say Yahshua. It says
mm,
Yahweh of the sky and Yahweh of the earth. And a lot of people, with the exception of John Batoni, think that Yahweh of the earth is Yahshua in a pre-existent form. I happen to believe that too right now, but he says he's going to convince me it's not, and I'm looking forward to that little discussion. But it would make a lot more sense to me if Yahshua was, as the Ebionites say, that he was just a man who at his baptism retained the spirit of Yahweh to go forth. But still, I'm believing in pre-existence. I'm going to keep on that until somebody can prove different. But
yeah,
yes,
I'm in
yeah,
that camp too. I'm in that camp too. The pre-existent. I also one of the other things too. When he says I and the Father are one, I don't think we really understand what oneness is all about. There's a spiritual element there that's needs to be spiritually determined. So there's that oneness there, but it's really not two different beings. It's that oneness. I don't know if I'm explaining myself right, but
there's oneness of substance and there's oneness of purpose. Obviously, Yeshua and the Father in the sky are not one of substance. And that's the Christian position, is
right.
that they're of the same substance. That's impossible for many reasons. But yeah, absolutely, we need to understand that better. And I'm sure there's somebody that can give us further knowledge on that. But all I know is there's several situations in the Old Testament, at least three that I mentioned right here. And what Yahshua himself says about his Father working and I'm working, it's as though they're working in tandem, and certainly they are. But
Hmm.
like you said, in a mysterious way, that right now we don't have an understanding that's sufficient to well, somebody like John to try to tell him that he's wrong. We just can't go to one or the other and be sure about it yet.
Hmm.
I'm about positive somebody has it. Maybe we'll be looking for that.
All
Thank
right,
you.
thanks.
Thank you. There I am again. The next is the number of the beast. Revelation 13:18 says, this calls for wisdom. the wisdom necessary for deciphering the number of his name, and now made manifest. This formula, okay, we'll call it formula, seems by far the most likely to me, logically, by far, especially when we see Tacitus telling us that he is the beast and the heads were there as well, exactly the same as Revelation chapter 17 and 18 tells us. So we take a look at the form of the emperor's name that's determined in the New Testament. And Luke 2:1 has the name Caesar, which is a name, the last name of Julius Caesar, we say, Caesar Augustus, Caesaros Augustu, and in Acts 11:28, we have Claudius Caesar there, Claudiu Caesaros. And for Nero, Caesaros Neron. In Greek, it's Neron. In Latin, it's Nero. So let's take a look at the letters of this name. Caesaros Neron there, if you can see it now. And what you have to do is you have to use the Hebrew words, Caesaros Neron. And then in order to put it into Greek, you've got to change the letters of the Hebrew to Greek letters, just as they are. You know, we didn't have any vowels in Hebrew at that time. That came along a long time later. So we're going to do that right here. And some of these letters, like the AI and this A here, they're not counted because those letters are not in the Hebrew. This is from Hebrew. Oh, okay. K, 20. I'm just going to use the English letters here. S, 200. R, 100. O, 70. And stigma S is 6 for Caesaros. And then we've got an N and another N at the end. Those two N's are worth 100. We have an R, looks like a P, but that's a row. That's 100. O again, 70. This looks like a V, but it's an N. That's the second N. So we have that ending up to 666. That is pretty good proof. However, there's more. There's more. So here we have the name. Oh, I forgot to have this on here. In Hebrew, I should say the English transliteration of the name. And I'm not good at Hebrew, so I use English. I guess probably I know about as much about it as you do. Cough, sin, resh, new, is it new? None, I can't remember. Resh, yod, new. See, I don't know beans when the bag's open. Adds up to 666. Obviously, you're going to have to use the Hebrew letters and translate them into Greek letters in order to come up with that. Here's some variants. This is an important one, and it's kind of good because we can see through the variant that it points to the very same thing. Because some of you may have in your Bible a footnote, you should have, got a good study Bible. Excuse me. Using the Latin letters with Hebrew equivalents, we get 616. We get six, not 666, 616. It'll usually say that at the bottom of the page. And then it will say some versions, this is 616. So the Latin versions. The Latin doesn't have the N on the end of Nero or Neron. So it comes to 616 and it comes up Caesar Nero in Latin. You know, back at those days, 200, 300 years after Yeshua, all the Bibles were in Latin. Still, some Bibles are translated from Latin. It gives us two different numbers that both equal the same thing. And just to show you an illustration here, here's Kaiseros Gaia. That's Caligula. He comes up to 606. So you would think if there's going to be one, he might be one because he tried to have his image set up in the Holy of Holies. But no, he doesn't come up to that number. So this is an example of another beast, not Nero, but Gaius, or Caligula was his nickname. Well, those two things, the number, the name, the wound, and reading in prophecies of that day, like the Sibylline oracles, tells us flat out that Nero is 666 and the beast. Sibylline oracles, I was going to get out that just to show you that. It is a very ancient, part pagan, part Christian prophecy book, installments of prophecies over quite a number of years, to the point where by the end of the Sibylline oracles means prophecies, it's all Christian stuff put in there. But it's a huge book. And I've read those in there, but I couldn't find them in the short time I had with this. Nevertheless, I did spend hours and hours and hours on this translating again. So if you go out to the website, which is yahadblogs.org/revelation, yahadblogs.org/revelation with a capital R. What was I going to say is out there? Oh, you're going to see a lot more pieces of chapters being put on there. My version, you'll find it's quite different than anything else you've had. And I hope that it's clearer in several ways. I hope that those traditional translated words, change them to put something that's more understandable. Like, for instance, the head wound in chapter 13. Later on, it talks about that, and it says in your Bible, a sword. A sword. Well, there's lots of different swords. And in some places, when the word sword is used, I look and see what kind of sword it is, like a Ramphaeon, for instance. I've learned that this is a different kind of sword than the straight Roman sword that they teach us there in the church and wherever. And in this case, in 13, the head wound was made by a dagger. A dagger, not a sword at all. So that makes it even more clear, because that's exactly what Nero and Epaphrodites used to supposedly kill him in the first place. Now, a dagger, as you may know, has two blades on it. Both sides of the metal part of the knife are sharpened, and those things are dangerous. All right, what did you do during the war? and we'll probably end up with this. People and situations. We're going to look back then to Jerusalem in 62 and on through 68, up through 70. But in 62, just before the war broke out, and we'll survey a little about the life of Yahshua's brother because he has something to do with this. That is James the Just, Yaakov HaZadik, one of my favorite characters to talk about. And what was done to him by the Jerusalem Pharisees and the high priesthood together. They didn't like those Nazarenes. They didn't like them. They killed them. We'll also recount the Nero redivivus lesson, Nero resurrected or reliving, how he came back to life. Not once, but several times he came back to life. That old sixth head. But we leave these ministries along with identities of the remaining heads in the beast until then. So we'll talk about in chapter 17, it'll probably be next week, we'll show you another big clue as to when this thing was written and what it was written about. But as far as James the Just, he was a very popular person among the poor. In fact, he was an opposition high priest. The people in Jerusalem and the millions of people that would come for the feasts, they didn't like those priests there. They were not personable. They were all rich. They thought not highly about poor people. They didn't care about them. They wouldn't help them. They stole their money. But this guy, James, came along. He was very popular to the point where the high priesthood of Jerusalem had to hire him on, so to speak, as an alternative high priest. This is a theory that's got to be true. There's just, again, too much evidence that it is. So, obviously, the real high priesthood, who was not the real high priesthood. James was a Zadokite priest. They were not. They were of other families. And at that particular time, was one of the 5 or 6 high priests of the family of Ananus, or Annas in the Gospels he's spoken of. Well, let's see. I don't want to forget this. Anyway, because they were on different calendars, the high priesthood was on the lunisolar calendar. James the Just and all his crew were on the Zadokite calendar. This was doable because they had different days for the feasts, especially for Yom Kippur, when James actually goes into the Holy of Holies. He actually goes in there where nobody is allowed, gets on his knees, prays for the sins of the people, and absolves them. This is what they expected. Why do they have to do that after Yeshua? That was the only way they had to get absolution according to what they knew. And in the meantime, the Nazarenes are teaching different, but they didn't get very far by that time. By 60, that's only 20 some years after the resurrection of Yeshua. But James is well known, and the story of his death is one that's worth recounting, and certainly you'll find it in the Nazarene Acts. That would be in volume 3. Flavius Josephus then, who also lived through this, in around 90 AD, he wrote again. He wrote the Antiquities of the Jews, and these are the words he wrote. Now, Caesar Nero, he's talking about Nero, upon hearing the death of Festus, who was not that guy on Gunsmoke, but a wretched, dishonest governor mentioned in the Acts, Festus, although his name means festive, he was not very festive. He was a wretch. sent Albinus into Judea. Albinus is a new governor, a new procurator. That's the same thing. But the king, Agrippa II, there's more people in this than the phone book, deprived Joseph of the high priesthood, speaking of Caiaphas, and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the son of Annas, or Ananus, or as they say in Kentucky, Anus, who was also himself called Ananus. He's in the New Testament as well as Annas. The father of 5 high priests is Annas, and his youngest son is called Ananias, or Ananias, or Anan, either one. 3 different ways he's talked about in different literature. So when you think Annas or Annas in the New Testament, you can also say that's the same name as Ananias. Now the report goes that this eldest Ananus proved a most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons who had all performed the office of a high priest to God, except Caiaphas was a son-in-law, but he was considered a son, and who had himself enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, back when Yeshua was born, which had never happened to any other priests. But this younger Ananus, or Ananias, who, as we've told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who were very rigid in judging offenders, above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. Then, therefore, Ananus was of this disposition. He thought he now had a proper opportunity. He was going to clean up those Nazarenes. Festus died. Albinus, his successor, was on the road trying to get there to Caesarea and Jerusalem to take his place as a procurator. So he, the young Annas, assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Yeshua, who was called Christos, whose name was James, Jacob, Yaakov. So it was telling us that the governor was on the road. The new high priest called the Sanhedrin. They brought before them James the Just, the man that was so popular with the priests, with the people, who was an alternative Nazarene high priest. And it says they brought some others with James. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. But as for those of the Sanhedrin who seemed the most equitable, that is fair, the most fair of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king, Agrippa II, who was probably 17 at that time, desiring him to send to Ananus the younger that he should act so no more. For that what he had already done was not to be justified. It wasn't legal for him to call Sanhedrin without the procurator knowing about it. Nay, some of them went also to meet Albinus as he was upon his journey from Alexandria in Egypt, and informed him that it was not lawful for Ananus the younger to assemble a Sanhedrin without his consent. Whereupon Albinus complied with what they said and wrote in anger to Ananus the younger, and threatened that he would bring him to punishment for what he'd done, that is, executing James and others, on which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him, and he had ruled but 3 months, and made Jesus, the son of Damnius, the high priest. Now, this guy who was made the high priest was an imbecile. We learn later from Josephus. So while the authenticity of some passages in Book 18 of the Antiquities has been subject to debate, the overwhelming majority of scholars consider the discussion of the death of James in section 9 of Book 20 to be authentic. Yeah, if you want to read Antiquities, you can leave off the first 19 books, just read the 20th book. All right, here's a quiz. Has nothing to do with what I just said, but I threw a quiz question in. We have seen a number of the important Romans and can recognize them on account of their portraits in stone. Why do we not have statues of some of these important Jews during this time? We don't know what they look like. Any ideas as to why?
Idolatry.
I think you hit it right on the head. So then in the 18th book of his Jewish Antiquities, Josephus bears witness to John as having been a Baptist, not a Southern Baptist. And the same writer, although not believing in Jesus as the Christ, that is Josephus, in seeking after the cause of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, says, nevertheless, being although against his will, not far from the truth, that these disasters happened to the Jews as a punishment for the death of James the Just, who was the brother of the Jesus who was called Christ, since they killed him despite his being supremely righteous. Now, again, that comes from Origen in his treatise Against Celsus, and it is further attested to in the Antiquities as well. Let's see, we want to go farther with this. We really have 20 more minutes. Oh, I want to get down to Nero, Saul-Paul, Josephus, and Antipas. I guess that's what we'll do next time. But to end up here, really jumping around a lot. Let me offer you a timeline. If you're a really good student of this, you'll want, and you don't have a timeline. This is a timeline. I went through everything personally and put it together with some explanation. My notes are on the website as notes on session 4 and 5. Even though this is 6, I didn't get through them in 4 and 5. I've got a lot of stuff here. Sorry. If you want to get that one out, download it. If you use that website and you click on a doc file, which most of them are, it's not going to come up on your screen. It's going to download someplace. So you can open it in your word processor. And so the one that says notes on sessions 4 and 5, if you want to take a look at this or anything I've done tonight, and plus a lot more, or this timeline, then download that one and look at it. Or if you're keeping this for later on when you're going to be teaching this to certain belligerent people, then you'll want to get into this again. First thing, in 66 AD, Nero sent the Great Tribulation upon the believers through the entire Roman world as punishment for the burning down of Rome in 64 AD. Okay, we're reviewing. That same year, 66, Roman general and governor Cestius Gallus unsuccessfully invaded Jerusalem. He was turned away by the Zealots, and they picked off his legions during their retreat, going through a place called Beth Horon, the Beth Horon siege, and past a place called called Megiddo, the Valley of Megiddo. That ring a bell? With that, the war began. In the next 2 years, all the cities in Galilee and Samaria, all of them, were destroyed with fire, poison, arrows, while residents there turned on each other, the Jews against the Greeks, massacring town after town each other, especially in the place called the Decapolis. All the trees were cut to make siege engines. All the rivers, wells, and lakes were poisoned, underlining the word all. All ships were sunk. All animals and produce went to feed the Romans. All legions were let go to pillage Galilee. The seas and rivers were flowing red with blood. Josephus was captured during this time, a place called Yotapata by Vespasian, after prophesying rightly a 47-day battle. One of my favorite places in Josephus, because he was there at this very battle, and he was the general for the other side. He was the general for Galilee against Vespasian, the one that would become emperor in 2 years. But as a general, Josephus wasn't executed, although that was what was planned for him, for he prophesied to Vespasian that Vespasian would become the ruler of the world and fulfill the fourth oracle of Balaam, found in Numbers 24, 15 through 24. This oracle predicts a star rising out of Yaakov and a scepter out of Israel, which is often interpreted as a messianic prophecy. It's been applied to Yeshua. Balaam foresees the ultimate triumph of Israel over various nations, including Moab and Edom. Vespasian keeps Josephus in chains until he was proclaimed emperor in 68 AD to fulfill that prophecy, which not only saved his life, but also may show us that these guys had some part of the plan of Yahweh for this particular place in the world. And I think certainly this was planned. In 68 AD, actually June the 16th, Nero committed suicide with the assistance of Epaphroditus. Now, last June 16th, 2024, I proclaimed Nero Day. It was on a Sunday, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. Now, Epaphroditus, again, was the secretary of Nero, had once been Nero's slave, probably sold into slavery as a child. And he also was St. Paul's journalist, traveling companion, and diary for a few years. He wrote the last chapters of the Acts of the Apostles. That's important to remember. And someday, soon, I'll be happy to prove that to those that don't think that could be possibly be. 68 to 69 was the year of the four emperors: Nero, Galba, Otho, Vitellius. John doesn't talk about them in the heads because they came and went so fast he probably didn't even know about it. But these were desperate men that were looking to take the seat of Nero when Nero disappeared for a while. But then in 70 AD, Flavius Vespasian, who with his son Titus, who was the seventh head from Revelation 17, who was to be there for just a little while, actually 2 years, they were the heroes that finished Israel from Dan to Beersheba. And in 70 AD, there came to pass what is called the rapture. Joshua, with 144,000 martyred saints, uniform and standing atop Mount Zion, supervising what Christians call the day of the Lord. Angels battling angels, spirits battling spirits, witnessed in the skies by Jerusalemites, spoken about in the Dead Sea Scrolls as the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And Revelation 14:1, next thing I want to do, I want to talk about following the saints through Revelation, because that will pretty much show us about this rapture idea that everybody thinks crazy, and the rest of them think it's going to happen in the next few days. It could, but it already happened. And I looked, and I saw a lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his father's name written upon their foreheads. And I heard a voice out of the sky, like the voice of many waters, and like the voice of loud thunder. And I heard the sound of harpists, not harpists, kitherists, kithering, they're kitheras. All right, I retranslated that today. Amazed, nothing about harps or lyres. The kitherists were playing or kithering their kitheras. And we've got a little bit of onomatopoeia there as well. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders. No one was able to learn that song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. What do they think about this? If this is going to happen, in the next 50 years, where are these guys going to come from? They're going to bring them up out of Sheol or out of Hades, or bring them up out of the pit, or where are they going to get these guys with all this time in between? Have they gone up to heaven to worship the saints of the Christian church? I don't know. But I do believe that happened, and it happened in a timely fashion then, when the hordes of Roman legions were there tearing down the walls of Jerusalem, and there right on the side was Mount Zion, which is also symbolic of the entire Jerusalem city, and we're going to get to that sometime. If we keep doing this, we're getting down to 2 people, 3 people. So when it gets down a little more, I'm not going to do any more unless I can get some people in here. The abomination of desecration is the next thing. The destruction of Jerusalem and its temple down to the foundation stones. Wouldn't that be desecration of the temple, of the Holy of Holies? Wouldn't that be desecration, that the whole thing is knocked down and burned? Why does it have to be some idol in there or something appearing in there? Desecration means desecration, destruction, perdition. One other note about this rapture thing. Revelation advises us that the 144,000 had to die first, and probably in some pretty horrible ways. I know that Jehovah's Witnesses say that they are of the 144,000, but there's more than 144,000 Jehovah's Witnesses. How do they know which few of their people are going to be the ones here? And are they willing to look through Revelation and see what actually happens to them? That they're persecuted and hung up and burned at the stake and everything else? I don't think that is going to be the case. They got to fill the bloody cup of the martyrs. That's a condition for anything happening, that the cup of martyrs must be filled. The bloody cup, which is actually the meaning of Damascus, bloody, dam, skous, cup. This cup, said Yahshua, is my blood. When the Essenes say the new covenant in the land, or in the land of Damascus, And they're the same thing as the Nazarenes. What are they talking about? The place called Damascus in Syria? Maybe. He says, "This cup is my blood. Drink all of it." And they all did. So when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the spirits of those spirits now, not souls, all who have been slain because of the word of Elohim and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, symbolically here, "How long, sovereign Yahweh, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Well, that's not very Christian. No, it isn't. No, but it's zealot, and it's certainly Roman. This is what they expected, and that's Revelation 6, 9 through 10. For the next few years, the Romans mopped up Israel, killed at least 1.5 million people in Jerusalem, or they starved to death, and sold the rest that weren't killed into slavery, especially the children and the women. Roman generals liked those children and women. And I suspect they bought so many that they didn't know what to do with them. The wives of the generals back in Rome or in Germany or wherever they were, they got very perturbed when these generals or these officers would take a mistress when they were on the field of battle. But it was a common thing to take boys. And sometimes we read about certain governors, when they're going away from their home for quite a while, they would take their own harem of boys. That was not considered to be adultery until later, at least not for officers or the wives of those people. That's got something to do here. What would I do today? Translated one talking about the concupiscence, the sex acts, illicit sex acts. One of the reasons why the trumpets blew and the 7 angels came down with their bowls. Oh, can't imagine, but it was common practice at that time. Then in AD 73, the 7 years of Revelation were up. That is what happened in the land with the capture of Masada, a fortress of the Israel rebels, fighters who were called zealots, down there by the Dead Sea. The last of the zealots on Masada committed suicide before the Romans reached them. 967 men, women, and children, with only a couple women surviving. And some of the lots that they drew to see who would kill who with names written on them. Yigael Yadin, well known, probably the greatest known archaeologist in Israel history, who was also a general of the wars. He's the one that excavated that, finding these lots and a lot of other stuff, along with some testimony there too. He has a book out from 1963 called Masada that gives you all the secrets you could find from archaeologically digging that place. So then the Olivet, the Revelation, and Josephus' book, The Jewish Wars, capture it all in such a clever way that only Jews in the dispersion could read them. Romans couldn't read this. They're written in prophetic code that even those who have studied all their lives have trouble interpreting. Why wouldn't some people talk about this as being in the future when they can make up their own stuff? I used to do that. I could do it too, make up my own stuff. This is better. While Jewish War was initially written in a little-known language, that is Aramaic, I think, for the Jews in the East, outside of Israel, and in Greek for Romans and the world. So he wrote the Jewish War in 2 different languages. One for Jews that he wrote in such a way, hoping the Romans wouldn't get a hold of it and try to figure it out. And for the Romans in Greek, which was the lingua franca of the world at that time, keeping them apart. The Aramaic version is not to be found anymore except in a Slavonic translation, that is Czechoslovakian translation that comes from the Middle Ages. It's completely different than Josephus's Greek edition. I've worked on both of them, and they're quite different. And the one from the Slavonic Aramaic translation has a lot about Yeshua and John the Baptist and a lot of other things that the Romans just didn't dare hear about. It makes me believe that Josephus was a believer and that he was probably eventually executed by his stepbrother, Domitian, the emperor. Okay, got time for a question if there's any.
Yeah, brother, I wanted to ask you about the 144,000. Now, weren't they like the pure? They were from each of the 12 tribes. So what I'm saying is how can it be in the future if the after 20 centuries, the mixing and the matching of all the different marriages and peoples, how can you expect a pureness to be there if they were supposed to be pure back then? You know what I'm saying?
That's the text that I translated today.
Right.
In some scriptures it says, for they were pure. But the word behind pure is Parthenon or Parthena, and that word means sexual virgins.
Mm.
All right. So they're pure on that account. They are not mixed up in illicit sexual acts, which is a big thing in Revelation. And they are the first fruits. They're the first group, first fruits of the spirit-bodied people of Yahshua, a Mashiach. You know, when you think about fruits, you're not talking about one or two or 25. You're talking about a lot. And that number, 144,000, 12 times 12 times 1,000, this is talking really about evangelism, what's going to happen to this movement. And by the time of this catching away, these people are going to be there in abundance, but they're going to have to die. Yes, I agree with you. That's a real good argument. I would say, though, that most people who think they're one of those people don't realize that their blood has to go in the cup of the martyrs if they're going to be them.
Mm-hmm.
It's just another little piece of evidence to put in with this preterist notion that this has all happened in the past. I'm sure it has. Yeah, exactly. Very, very good. One thing about it is it has to happen in 7 years. If it's going to happen again, it's got to be exactly like it's got to fulfill all those things in the sequence that it's going to, else it wouldn't say, don't add or subtract anything from this. It gives us a word that says why, so they can place this in history, and you can't take Revelation 12 out of there about the woman and the son and try to apply that to something that happened in Bangladesh. That doesn't work. It might be something that happens similar. I've seen a woman in the sky between the sun and the moon in the birthing position, but of course, I imagine the woman up there when I saw at the same time the sun and the moon in the sky. I thought, oh, that's what it would look like. Okay. So yeah, exactly. Thank you, brother. You've got a list you're gonna write. I look forward
Exactly.
to talking
Yes.
to you about that. Yeah. Okay. I think we'll go now and I'll go have a bite to eat, and you can go have your fourth martini. Good night. Thank you for coming. Love you.